There is something quiet happening in the arch of your foot right now. Not dramatic, just continuous. A kind of background tension you've stopped noticing because it's been there long enough to feel like the baseline, like something you were born with rather than something that accumulated. Part of you may have registered it already, somewhere below the level of conscious attention, in the way you sometimes become aware of a sound only after it stops. The instep press begins there. 45 seconds of sustained pressure on the inner arch, the vault of the foot, and something changes in the face. Not because of metaphor, not because of imagery or positive intention or wishful thinking, because the tissue connecting those two places is continuous, follows mechanical laws, and responds predictably when you work with those laws, rather than ignoring them. Two models exist for understanding what happens to the human face as the decades pass, and they begin in completely different places. One model says the face changes at the face. Skin loses its elasticity, fat redistributes downward, bone slowly remodels. These are real processes, well documented, producing real and measurable changes. According to this model, the appropriate response is local. Creams and devices for the skin, injectables to address volume, procedures aimed directly at what you see when you look in the mirror. Something else has been largely absent from that conversation. Another model exists, built on the same anatomy, the same physics, the same basic understanding of how the body is structured, and it points toward a different starting place entirely. This model says the face is the upper terminal of a mechanical chain. Gravity doesn't only pull facial structures down from above. Below the face, below the neck, below the thorax, there is a continuous column of tissue running from the sole of your foot to the muscles that govern the position of your jaw, your tongue, and the bones of your midface. Chronic shortening in that column pulls everything above it downward. Some portion of what we read as facial aging is the accumulated mechanical load of a tensional system that has been slowly shortening for years. Both models are real. Both describe something true. The question is not which model is correct. The question is what each model reaches and what each one misses, and whether the territory one misses happens to be the territory that changes what's available to you. Let me trace the anatomy before anything else, because the anatomy is where the argument either holds together or falls apart. When you look at the sole of your foot, you are looking at one end of the longest tensional chain in the human body. The inner arch, the vault, sits where several important structures converge. There is a dense, fibrous band running the entire length of the sole from heel to toes beneath the skin. Beside it, deeper in, is a long, thin muscle running up the inner border of the lower leg that most people couldn't name, but that everyone uses every time they push off from the ground. And beside that is the long flexor of the big toe, which sounds minor and is anything but. These structures don't stop at the ankle. They continue upward, and here is what matters most. They continue without a break. Not adjacent to each other, continuous with each other. The tissue transitioning from one form to another, the way river water transitions from a wide, shallow stretch to a narrow, deep channel. Same water, changed form, not interrupted. That continuity runs up the inside of the lower leg, through the inner knee, through the inner thigh, up through the deep pelvis, where these structures connect to the deepest layer of muscle holding the abdomen together, and to the muscle running along either side of the spine. From there, the chain continues up along the front of the spine itself, through the chest, past the collarbone, into a small bone that floats at the base of the tongue. That bone is connected above to the tongue itself, and through the tongue and the muscles around it, the chain reaches into the structures of the jaw, the muscles beneath the cheekbones, the tissue governing the quality of the midface that most people are trying to address with topical products or aesthetic procedures. This is one system, not similar systems, not adjacent systems. One continuous tensional web, running from the vault of the foot to what you see when you look at your face. In clinical anatomy, this structure has a name, the deep front line. The name is useful because it gives you something to refer to. The plain language description is more useful because it tells you what the name can't. That this tissue was never divided. That the divisions are conceptual categories applied by specialties that don't often talk to each other. And that the separation between what happens to the foot and what happens to the face is, at the tissue level, not a separation at all. Take a moment with the implications of that before we go further. If you've spent years working on your face, your neck, your jaw, and seen results that felt partial or temporary, one reason may be that you were addressing the terminal end of a system without addressing the system. If the foot, specifically the inner arch, is where this chain originates and where it carries its greatest accumulated load, then beginning treatment at the face is a bit like trying to change the tension on a guitar string by working only at the tuning peg while leaving the bridge unchanged. You can make adjustments. They won't hold as well as they should because the anchor has been ignored. That image won't carry all the way. No image does. But it points toward the structural logic that the Instep press depends on. Now let me build the logical argument explicitly, because the science of fascial systems is sometimes communicated in ways that allow for hand-waving where precise reasoning is required. Here is what we can establish without controversy. The body is a continuous structure. There is no place in the living body where tissue simply stops and another tissue begins in empty space. What appears to be separation in anatomy textbooks reflects the conventions of cadaver dissection, not the reality of living tissue. This is not a fringe position. Any anatomist working in fresh tissue will confirm it. The tissue is also pre-tensioned. It does not hang loose and transmit force only when directly loaded. Like a tent, it is always under some degree of tension, and that background tension means mechanical changes anywhere in the system are felt throughout the system simultaneously. The question then is not whether mechanical force can travel from the instep to the face. In a pre-tensioned continuous system, the more precise statement is that the system is already everywhere at once, and a change in local tension is a change in global tension. You are not sending a message from the foot to the face. You are changing the state of a system that is already, always, spanning the entire distance. From those two established facts, the logical conclusion follows without requiring any additional premises. Chronic shortening at the instep is chronic shortening of the entire deep front line. It is not chronic shortening of the foot with a diminishing effect as you move up the chain. The tent does not become less affected the farther you get from the changed peg. The canvas is all one piece. Now, someone who holds firmly to Model A would reasonably ask, but do these mechanical changes actually translate into visible facial change? Fair question. The logical necessity of force transmission doesn't automatically guarantee clinically observable results. Here, the evidence becomes more observational than theoretical, and I want to be honest about that. The logic is airtight. The clinical pattern is consistent enough that I find it impossible to dismiss. Whether the precise magnitude of facial change from instep work alone has been measured and quantified in controlled trials? No, not to my knowledge. What has been measured is the propagation of force through the deep front line under experimental conditions, with force applied to the plantar surface and displacement measured at the hip and lumbar spine. The chain transmits force. The logic of what that means for the face follows from the anatomy. The clinical pattern, which I'll describe shortly, supplies the observational evidence that the theoretical logic predicts. Before moving into the clinical territory, I want to use an analogy from a completely different domain, because it illuminates something about how these two models relate to each other at the level of basic thinking. Everyone says the stage set is like a canvas for the actor's performance, a neutral surface that simply supports what happens above it, mostly invisible when the work is going well. A stage does share that quality with a canvas. Both become less visible when the performance is strong. Both recede behind what happens in front of them. But a stage has one critical difference from a canvas, and that difference is the whole point. A canvas hangs from above and is kept in tension by what pulls at its edges. A stage sits on a floor, and every element of the set above it, every platform, every raked surface, every structure that creates the visual world of the production, depends entirely on whether that floor is level and stable. A scenic designer can build extraordinary work on a well-leveled stage. Put the same design on a floor that lists 3 degrees to the left, and no amount of skill at the level of the set itself compensates. The floor is not the performance. The floor determines what the performance can be. Model A is the conversation about the performance, the visible materials of the face, the skin, the fat, the structural elements of bone. These are real, and working at that level produces real changes. Model B asks a question that the conversation about performance rarely addresses. How level is the floor? Most people who seek facial work are excellent scenic designers, trying to build on a floor nobody has examined. The Instep press is, at its most basic level, an attempt to level the floor. Not instead of the performance level work, in addition to it, and in some cases before it, because the floor determines what the work above can hold. The analogy breaks down, as all analogies do, when you push it past what it can carry. A stage floor shifts dramatically and suddenly. A fascial system shifts gradually, over months. But the structural principle, what the audience sees, depends on what it rests on, holds. Everything I've just walked you through, the vault of the foot, the continuous tissue chain from sole to cheekbone, the logic of pretension systems, and what it means for how mechanical change propagates through the body. This is the foundation on which the connected face protocol is built. 12 fascial release exercises, sequenced across 30 days, with labeled diagrams showing exactly where to place your hands for each one, and a daily tracking sheet so you can observe what's shifting week by week. Find it in the description and the pinned comment. For now, let's return to the open question, because the logic we've built so far raises something specific. Why the instep? Among every accessible point along the deep front line, from the sole of the foot all the way to the jaw, what makes the instep the most effective starting place? First, let me use the second analogy. Everyone says that seasoning is like adding flavor. You take an essentially complete dish and enhance it through the addition of salt, acid, heat. Seasoning does share something with flavoring. The experience does improve. The dish does become more satisfying. But seasoning has one critical difference from flavoring, and understanding that difference changes how you think about the instep press. Flavoring adds something that wasn't there before. Certain seasonings, salt in particular, reorganize what's already present. Applied to raw protein before cooking, salt draws moisture out and then allows it to be reabsorbed in a fundamentally restructured form. The interior texture of the tissue changes, not because something was added to it, but because its existing components were given the conditions to rearrange into a more functional configuration. The instep press is not additive. Nothing is injected, nothing applied, nothing placed where there was nothing before. The work is reorganizational. The tissue at the instep is not lacking something, it is carrying too much. Too much resting tension, too much adaptive shortening, accumulated through years of loading patterns that have slowly pulled it away from its natural resting length. The press doesn't add anything. It creates the conditions for the tissue to return to a length and tone closer to what it held before the accumulation. This distinction, addition versus reorganization, matters for how you understand what success looks like. Additive treatments have immediate visible effects because you can see what was added. Reorganizational treatments look like nothing happened at first, and then one day you realize something is different, and you can't point to what caused it because what happened was a subtraction of something you'd stopped noticing was there. That quality of change is quieter. It's also, in my observation, more durable because it reflects an actual change in the tissue's default state rather than a supplement to a tissue state that remains unchanged. Model A is largely additive. Volume where volume was lost. Relaxation where there was excess tension in a single muscle. Structural support where structures have descended. All of these are valid responses to real changes, and I have never argued against them. Model B is reorganizational. It asks what the system is carrying that it doesn't need to carry, and whether creating the conditions for release is sufficient to produce visible change without adding anything at all. The clinical pattern suggests it is sufficient. Not universally, and not always to the degree that additive treatments can achieve, but to a consistent and meaningful degree for most people who practice consistently over weeks. Let me tell you what I've seen, because the pattern has become unmistakable over time. When someone comes through the door who has spent years in desk work, years of commuting, years in footwear that doesn't allow the arch to move naturally, the posture they carry tells a story that precedes anything they say. The inner arch is often compromised in one of two ways. In some people, it is flat, the medial border of the foot nearly touching the ground, the arch completely collapsed. In others, it is held high but rigid, what looks like a good arch, but feels on palpation like clay that has been compressed and dried, rather than a structure that can load and rebound. Both ends of that spectrum show up in my observation in the face. The midface is drawn slightly downward and inward, not dramatically enough to name at first glance, subtly, in a way that you see most clearly in photographs taken 5 years apart, where the viewer often locates the change in the eyes or the cheeks without being able to say precisely what shifted. When the same person begins consistent footwork, and I mean weeks of daily practice rather than a single session, something begins to shift in the face as well. The tissue beneath the eye changes quality. The region between the inner corner of the eye and the corner of the mouth, a zone many people address with filler, softens in a way that isn't the softening of added volume, but the softening of released tension. The apparent heaviness of the lower face, which most observers attribute to volume descent, partly resolves. This doesn't happen in every case with equal magnitude. Clinical work is never universal, but the pattern appears often enough and consistently enough that I stopped treating it as coincidence somewhere in my 3rd decade of practice. What made it impossible to set aside was a specific category of observation. Patients who came for foot-related work, orthopedic in its intent, and who reported facial changes several months later without any expectation that facial change was possible. These were not people who came seeking aesthetic improvement. They had no investment in the outcome, no reason to report what they were seeing if they weren't genuinely seeing it. 3 women in particular marked the pattern most clearly for me. None came for facial work. All reported facial changes in their own words, unprompted, before I raised the possibility. All described it similarly. Not a dramatic transformation, but a sense that the face felt less effortful, less held, less pulled. That sequence of events, patient notices, patient reports, clinician confirms, carries a different evidential weight than any sequence where the expectation of change is introduced before the observation. Clinical evidence of this kind doesn't constitute formal proof. What it constitutes is a hypothesis that the anatomy already predicts, now corroborated by consistent clinical observation. The hypothesis. The tensional component of facial position is real, is influenced by mechanical state at the distal end of the deep front line, and can be changed through sustained work at the instep. Nothing in 40 years of practice has disconfirmed that hypothesis. Now, back to the question. Why the instep specifically, rather than some other point along this long chain? The answer requires understanding something about how continuous tensional systems distribute and store a load. When such a system is chronically overloaded, the load doesn't distribute evenly across every point. It concentrates at structural junctions, places where multiple tensional lines converge, where the tissue density is greatest, and where the mechanical leverage on the rest of the system is highest. The instep is one of these junctions. Every step you've taken in your life has passed load through the inner arch. Every hour of standing, every kilometer of walking, every period of wearing footwear that prevents natural arch movement has compressed those structures repeatedly, without the rebound that natural foot movement would have provided. The tissue here carries a depth of accumulated load that mid-chain structures simply do not. That concentration of load has a particular implication for treatment. At a convergence point, you are not releasing one structure. You are releasing the state of every structure that passes through that junction simultaneously. Working at the hip flexors changes the hip flexors. Working at the instep changes the hip flexors, the adductors, the structures of the anterior spine, and everything they connect to above. because all of those structures trace back through the instep as their common origin. Hip flexors matter. Working there is worthwhile. But the hip flexors are a mid-chain location. Releasing mid-chain tension without addressing the anchor on which that tension rests is analogous to loosening a spring from the middle. You change the local coiling, but the spring's overall state is determined by its fixed points. The instep is the fixed point. Beyond the purely mechanical, there is a neurological dimension worth understanding. The inner arch contains an unusually high density of mechanoreceptors, small structures embedded in the tissue that continuously monitor the mechanical state of the fascia and report to the nervous system. These receptors respond to sustained, moderate pressure by sending signals that reduce resting motor tone throughout the connected network, not only in the immediate area of the press. Throughout the tensional system, the mechanoreceptors are embedded in. This is the neurological layer of what the instep press does, running in parallel with the direct mechanical reorganization of tissue. The press works through two channels simultaneously: the direct physical reorganization of chronically shortened tissue and the neurological signal that tells the motor system to reduce resting tone throughout the deep front line. Both channels activate within the same 45-second window. Below roughly 30 seconds, neither channel has had time to complete its initial cycle. Between 45 seconds and 90 seconds is the window where both mechanisms are engaged without triggering a protective guarding response. Beyond 90 seconds, the tissue can begin to respond with increased tone rather than decreased tone, as the nervous system interprets the sustained pressure as a threat rather than a communication. 45 seconds is not a round number chosen for convenience. It is the center of the window where the system accepts the input as information rather than resisting it as intrusion. Several years ago, a colleague who worked in somatic bodywork mentioned something in passing during a conversation that had nothing to do with the face. She had been noticing, she said, that clients who received extended footwork often reported a perceptual change afterward. Their vision felt different. Not sharper in the clinical sense, not a change in acuity that would register on an eye chart, but a change in the felt sense of visual space. The periphery seemed wider. Objects at the edges seemed somehow more accessible. At the time, I had no strong explanation for this. The observation went into a mental folder of things that were interesting and unreduced. Later, working through the anatomy of the deep front line in more detail, an explanation emerged that seems plausible. The upper terminus of the deep front line connects through the hyoid bone into the suprahyoid muscles, the muscles above the hyoid that pull upward toward the floor of the mouth and the tongue. The fascial connections that run in that territory also connect to the orbital region indirectly through the tissue of the orbital floor. The muscles suspending the eye within the orbit are not isolated from the broader tensional network. When that network is chronically loaded, the orbital region carries mild chronic tension as part of the global pattern. Releasing the network from its anchor at the instep may genuinely change the felt quality of the orbital region, not the optics, but the muscular and fascial environment that surrounds and influences the eye's resting position and degree of accommodative tension. My colleague had observed the effect without a framework for understanding it. The anatomy, later, provided the framework for something that was already being consistently noticed in practice. This is the direction that interests me most in terms of where further investigation should go. Not toward validating the foot-face connection theoretically, which the anatomy already justifies, but toward mapping precisely which facial regions respond to instep work, in what sequence, with what magnitude, and under what conditions the effect is most pronounced. For now, the anatomy and the clinical pattern align. Where those two lines converge is where it makes sense to begin. Let me walk you through what a session actually looks like, not as a list of instructions, but as a sequence of events I've witnessed and guided across many years. Because understanding what happens step by step and what people report as it happens is more useful than any abstract instruction could be. She sits in a chair and removes her shoe. The foot, without the shoe, shows the compression clearly, the inner border flattened toward the floor. The arch not so much absent as compressed into a rigidity that prevents movement rather than supporting it. Years of constrictive footwear have not destroyed the arch, but have held it in a shortened, adapted state. She crosses the right leg over the left knee, so the sole of the right foot is accessible. The press begins with the thumb of the left hand placed at the high point of the inner arch, just forward of center. Not at the ball of the foot, not at the heel. At the vault itself, the inner peak of the arch, where the tissue is most dense and where the convergence of structures sits closest to the surface. The pressure is firm, but not painful. The comparison I found most useful is pressing into a ripe fruit until you feel the initial resistance of the skin beneath, that degree of pressure, held without increasing. She holds. Around 20 seconds, something shifts in the lower leg. Not pain. A change in the texture of a tension she hadn't been aware of until the comparison became available through the beginning of its release. She mentions it. The calf feels different, slightly less gripped. Around 30 seconds, she mentions something in the jaw, a quality of holding she hadn't been aware of. Not an ache, nothing dramatic, more like the subtle mechanical shift you might feel when a door that has been slightly stuck in its frame finally settles into alignment. 45 seconds. The pressure releases. She sits for a moment with the foot returned to the floor and her hands still. She stands slowly. She moves her jaw experimentally. Without being prompted, her hands come up to her face, touching the area beneath the cheekbones, and she holds them there for a few seconds without saying anything. What she's registering is the change in the resting tone of structures she's been carrying unconsciously for years. Not dramatic. Not what most people imagine when they think about facial lifting. More like the difference between a held breath and a released one. Not visible in the abstract, but unmistakable to the person experiencing it. One session changes things for a few hours. 2 weeks of consistent daily practice, both sides, 45 seconds each, changes the tissue's default resting state. After a month, many people find that the change has become their new baseline. The release state feels normal, and returning to the old state feels like something they can now identify and correct. What accumulates toward, in most people who practice consistently, is a shift in the midface. The area beneath the cheekbones sits differently. The region below the inner corner of the eye changes tone. The line between the midface and the lower face, the boundary that most people associate with the look of aging, softens. Not uniformly in everyone, and not to the same magnitude in everyone, but in a direction that is consistent with releasing the tensional load the deep front line has been placing on its own upper terminal. 3 observable changes come in sequence as the practice develops, and knowing what to look for makes you a more reliable witness to your own process. The first change is in the foot itself, not the face. After several consistent sessions, the tissue under the thumb begins to feel different. Less compacted, with more give, with a quality that suggests it is moving from that dried clay texture towards something closer to living elasticity. This is not imagined. This is the reorganization beginning. When the tissue changes quality under pressure, the resting state is genuinely shifting. The anchor is releasing. The second change typically appears in the lower body before it appears in the face. People report a different quality to walking, fuller foot contact with the ground, a stride that feels slightly longer, a sense that the leg is operating from a more stable base. This reflects the chain releasing its tension upward from the ankle through the inner leg. Where you feel this, you can be reasonably confident the release is propagating as it should. The third change, the facial change, comes in a way that can be missed if you expect something dramatic. It doesn't arrive as lifting in the conventional aesthetic sense. It arrives as a reduction in a quality of tension you had normalized. People describe the face as feeling like it can rest, less pulled, less effortful. Some describe their resting expression as softer than they expected, more aligned with how they thought they looked before photographs surprised them. Photographs in consistent conditions, same light, same angle, same expression, taken 4 weeks apart. This is the most honest way to observe the process. The change you're looking for is not transformation. The change is the removal of something that had been added, gradually and invisibly, by years of mechanical loading. What you see, if you see it, is a face closer to its natural resting position. Not a younger face in the sense of reversed aging, a face less under load. That is a different thing, and it matters that you understand the difference before you begin. Managing expectations accurately is not about lowering them. It's about directing them toward what is actually available. Because what is actually available, when understood clearly, is genuinely significant. Here is where the two models, placed side by side, tell different stories. Not just about the body, but about the experience of having one. Model A describes a face losing things. Losing volume, losing support, losing density, losing the structural scaffolding that gave it particular form. The narrative is subtraction. The appropriate response within that narrative is restoration, adding back what was lost, compensating for what is gone. If you hold this model, the face is in deficit. You are behind. Every year adds to the gap between what the face is and what it was. Model B describes something different. Model B describes a face under load, not losing, but bearing, carrying years of accumulated mechanical tension from a system that was never designed to maintain so much chronic compression. The face in this model is not in deficit. The face is encumbered. Encumbrance can be lifted. That distinction carries more practical weight than it might seem. If the face is losing something, the emotionally appropriate response is grief alongside remediation. You are trying to recover what was taken. If the face is bearing something, the emotionally appropriate response is release. You are not recovering anything. You are setting down what doesn't need to be carried. People who work with Model B alongside Model A, rather than treating them as competing alternatives, tend to carry a different relationship to what they see in the mirror. Not a denial of change. Bodies change, and some of those changes are independent of tension patterns and will not respond to fascial work. Not a false reassurance, but a genuine curiosity about what is mechanical and therefore movable, alongside clarity about what is structural and requires different kinds of attention. That curiosity changes the quality of the practice. Working with the Instep press becomes less about fixing something broken and more about listening to what the system is carrying and creating the conditions for it to set the load down. Years of watching people develop this practice have taught me that the ones who understand the distinction tend to be more consistent, more patient with the timeline, and more accurate in their observations of change. Not because they've lowered their expectations, but because they've directed them accurately toward what the practice can provide. What it can provide is a face that carries less than it did. Not a different face, the same face under less. The vault of the foot doesn't know what it's connected to. The system it belongs to carries the logic everywhere, from the ground up, through every structure in its path, through the deep front line, all the way to the mirror. If this kind of thinking interests you, and I mean the approach of understanding the body as a continuous system, rather than a collection of parts with separate specialists, there is more here. Other structures contribute to the same chain we've been examining today. The way the jaw sits at rest changes how the neck functions. Neck function changes how load distributes across the spine. Spinal load changes the resting position of the pelvis, and pelvic position feeds back down through the entire chain to the foot. The system doesn't have a beginning or an end. It has junctions that happen to be particularly accessible. Each of those connections goes as deep as the one we've explored today. Each one changes the way you look at what the body is doing when it appears to be doing nothing at all. If something in this conversation landed, leaving a comment about what felt recognizable, or what surprised you, or what you're going to start paying attention to, helps me understand where the most useful work is. Subscribing keeps you in the conversation as it continues. There's a particular moment that tends to happen in practice, and I want to describe it carefully because it doesn't announce itself the way you might expect. It happens a few weeks in, sometimes longer. You're doing something ordinary. You're washing your face, or you're in a meeting, or you're driving, and you notice something in the quality of your own expression that you don't have an immediate word for. Not that you look different, something in how the face is resting. A slight shift in where things sit when nothing is asking them to perform. Most people don't register it as a result of the practice at first. They assume they're just less tired than usual, or that the light is different, or that something in their mood is showing. They move on. Then it happens again. And then they start to pay attention to what they notice in the days they've been consistent with the practice versus the days they haven't. The connection becomes legible. Not dramatic, not the kind of before and after that gets photographed and captioned. Something quieter and more reliable than that. What they're noticing is a change in the resting state of the system. Not a change in what the face looks like when it's engaged, what it looks like when it's doing nothing. That distinction matters enormously, and it tends to get lost in almost every conversation about facial appearance that happens in popular media. The focus is almost always on the engaged face, the performed face, the face captured in a photograph taken at a specific angle under specific light. But you don't live in photographs. You live in the between moments, the transitions, the neutral. And the neutral is where fascial tension is most visible, because there's nothing else carrying the load. When the deep front line is chronically shortened, the neutral is not actually neutral. It's a held position that costs something to maintain, that pulls at the structures above it, that communicates to anyone who looks at the face that something is being carried even when nothing particular is happening. People read this without being able to articulate what they're reading. They describe it as looking tired, or worried, or older. What they're actually perceiving is residual mechanical load expressed through surface structure. The face isn't performing worry. It's holding the physical shape that tension creates. This is why the work changes the neutral without changing the face. The bones are where they are. The proportions are what they are. The decades of expression that have shaped the patterns of the tissue are written in and not going anywhere. But the additional load that tension places on top of all of that can be reduced. When it is, the neutral shifts. The face at rest begins to communicate something closer to what the system actually is when it isn't carrying anything extra. That's the work. That's specifically what this practice is doing and why it works through the foot and the line rather than through the face directly. There is a question I receive regularly about bilateral symmetry, and it's worth addressing here because it connects to something important about how fascial tension actually distributes. Most people, when they begin paying careful attention to their face, notice that it isn't perfectly symmetrical. This is universal. No face is. But they'll often notice that the asymmetry isn't random, that one side tends to carry more tension, that the cheek on one side sits differently, that one eye appears marginally smaller, or that the jaw appears to sit fractionally lower on one side than the other. They want to know whether the Instep press can address this. The answer is that it can address the component of that asymmetry that is tensional. And the reason that component is significant is that tension accumulates asymmetrically for specific reasons that are worth understanding. Most people have a dominant side in the truest mechanical sense. Not just handedness, but a side they weight more heavily when standing, a side they favor when shifting their balance, a side through which they habitually bear load. Over time, the fascial system on that side adapts differently than the other. The deep front line on the dominant side tends to develop greater resting tone because it's been asked to carry more often and has organized itself accordingly. That differential tone propagates up the line on one side versus the other. When it reaches the structures of the face, it expresses as asymmetry. Not the structural asymmetry of bone position, which is permanent, but the tensional asymmetry of tissue under differential load, which is changeable. Working the Instep press bilaterally, meaning giving attention to both feet and paying careful attention to whether one side requires more work, more time, or produces a different quality of sensation, begins to address this. Not overnight and not completely, because some component of facial asymmetry is architectural and won't respond to soft tissue intervention. But the tensional layer, the part contributed by decades of asymmetric load distribution, tends to shift when the underlying cause is addressed. What's interesting is that people often report that the side they've been weighting more heavily is also the side where the Instep press reveals more restriction. The system is consistent. It carries the record of how it's been used in the quality of the tissue, and the tissue of the instep reflects the loading patterns of the entire chain above it. This is one of the reasons why the instep press can serve as a diagnostic practice, not just a therapeutic one. How it feels under the foot, where the restriction lives, whether it's bilateral or unilateral, whether it's in the inner arch, the outer edge, the heel, or the ball of the foot. All of that is information about what the fascial system above it has been organized around. Learning to read that information is a practice in itself. I want to talk about timeline, because most people who begin this practice have a distorted expectation. And the distortion runs in both directions. Some expect change in days. Some assume that because the problem took decades to develop, it will take an equivalent time to address. Neither is quite accurate. The fascial system responds within what physiologists call viscoelastic timescales. This means that it has both an elastic component, which responds immediately and returns to its resting state when the input stops, and a viscous component, which responds more slowly but holds the change after the input has been removed. The ratio between these two components determines how quickly change accumulates. What this means practically is that you'll often notice something immediately after the practice that doesn't fully hold into the next day. That's the elastic component. The immediate response is real, but it lives in the tissue's short-term behavior, not its long-term organization. The viscous component, the part that rewrites the resting state rather than temporarily altering it, requires repetition and time. The research on fascial remodeling suggests that meaningful changes in resting tone and tissue organization are detectable at around 8 to 12 weeks of consistent practice, not dramatic transformation. Meaningful change in the resting state of the system, the kind of change that begins to be visible in the neutral face rather than only perceptible to the person practicing. The people who succeed with this timeline are the ones who stop looking for the result daily and start looking for it weekly. Daily comparison produces noise. The system fluctuates based on sleep quality, hydration, stress, how much the jaw has been working, whether the practitioner has been sitting for hours or moving. Weekly comparison, or even monthly, filters out the fluctuation and reveals the underlying trend. The underlying trend, for people who are consistent, tends to be unmistakable by month 3. There's a subtler timeline operating as well, which is the timeline of proprioceptive awareness. This is the change not in the tissue itself, but in your relationship to what the tissue is doing. The ability to notice in real time when tension is accumulating, where it's accumulating, and what in your posture or behavior is generating it. This kind of awareness develops more slowly than tissue change and tends to be undervalued in conversations about practice. But it's actually the more durable result. Tissue can accumulate tension again. Awareness of what's accumulating it and the ability to intervene earlier changes the baseline you're maintaining between sessions. People who develop this awareness describe a different relationship to their daily life. They begin to notice the moments when they hold their breath in response to stress, and how breath holding engages the deep front line. They notice the postures they fall into when concentrating, and how those postures load the line asymmetrically. They notice what happens to the jaw at the end of a difficult conversation, and they begin to understand that the jaw's behavior in that moment is downstream of everything else the system has been managing. None of this requires constant vigilance. Vigilance about the body tends to produce its own tension, which is counterproductive. What it requires is enough familiarity with the system's patterns that the moments of accumulation become recognizable without effort. The Instep press practice, done consistently, builds this familiarity from the ground up. It creates a daily moment of contact with the base of the system, a check-in with what the vault of the foot is carrying, that gradually extends into a more general sensitivity to what the entire system is doing. This is why I often describe the practice as a conversation rather than a treatment. It isn't applied to the body. It creates the conditions for the body to speak legibly about what it's been organizing around. And it creates a practitioner who is capable of listening. Some of the most significant moments I've observed in people developing this practice are not the moments of physical change. They're the moments of recognition. The moment someone realizes that the jaw tension they've been treating as a jaw problem has roots in a breathing pattern they adopted in a particular period of their life. The moment someone connects the asymmetry they've been seeing in their face to a habitual postural preference they weren't aware they had. The moment the face stops being a mystery and starts being legible. That legibility doesn't make change easier in a naive sense. It doesn't mean the tension simply dissolves once you understand it, but it changes the quality of the relationship to the practice. It becomes less effortful and more curious. And curiosity, maintained over time, accomplishes more than effort does. What you see in the mirror at the beginning of this practice is the accumulated record of how the system has been used. Every year of held breath, every posture organized around chronic load, every pattern of tension that became the resting state, all of it is visible in the surface, expressed through the tissue in ways that no amount of targeted external intervention can reach. What you see in the mirror after months of this practice is the same record, minus what the system was willing to set down when given the opportunity. Not a different record, not an erased one, the authentic one, underneath the layer of what was being carried. That's the word I want to leave you with, because it was where we started. At the beginning of this conversation, I asked you to think about what the face looks like when it isn't performing anything. When nothing is being held and nothing is being managed and the surface is just resting on what supports it. That image, the face at rest, before the mirror, before the assessment, in the moment before self-consciousness arrives, is both the starting point and the destination. The practice doesn't move you away from that face and toward a different one. It moves you toward that face and away from what has been layered on top of it. The layer isn't cosmetic, it's mechanical. It lives in the tissue and it can be addressed through the system. And the ground floor of the system is directly under your foot. The vault of the arch has been waiting the whole time to be asked.